I'm an urban planner by training, and for about 8 years I worked with mental health professionals, and my work with them was to help them understand how social context, where we live, where we work, where we go to school, what our neighbors and communities like, and how they impact mental health and well-being. And in the course of my work with mental health professionals, I did a lot of community-based research around violence in urban communities. I did my work in Chicago, which has some pretty serious issues with community violence, and I hosted a number of focus groups and interviews with youth during that 8-year period around asking them questions about their perception of the origins of violence in their community. And often they would talk about food. You have to do whatever you need to do to get food. So if you have no income, no employment, it might mean that you have to do things that are outside of the legal employment system to get money to get food. So they suggested that one of the drivers of violence was the need to eat. So if you have to deal drugs, which is a source of violence and behavior, if you've got to burglarize, you just did what you had to do to eat. And so that was my first exposure of the connection between food and violence in communities. Toward the end of the 8 years when I was working on this topic, I was doing a focus group with adult men in one of Chicago's more violent communities. And I asked the same question again. What is one of the drivers of violence in your community? And one of the gentlemen said, an older gentleman, and I reference his age because he was old enough to have watched the food supply change over the previous 4 decades. And he said to me, "This food is making us crazy." And at that moment, I thought, this is really significant and interesting way of connecting food to community violence. It's a way I hadn't thought of before. And around the same time, I was reading research written by nutritional neuroscientists who were also linking food to behavioral health, specifically linking nutritional deficiencies to aggressive and violent and other forms of antisocial behavior. And I began to think, well, what if this lack of access to nutritious food for entire communities of people is part of the explanation for why there is community violence? It's not the sole explanation, but I thought it might be a missing piece of the puzzle that's worth exploring. At that point, I developed 2 maps. I found 2 maps. One was a map of Chicago's food deserts. Chicago is comprised of 77 communities, and this map showed those communities that were food deserts, and these are places where people do not have easy access to nutritious foods. These are places where people buy their food at gas stations, convenience stores, and liquor stores. I overlaid that map with the map of the city's most violent communities, those communities that had the highest rates of gun violence and homicide. It was clear to me that after looking at those maps that there was a relationship between food deserts and communities that have high levels of violence. And I acknowledge that there are other variables that play a role in that relationship. There was clearly an association, at least. I couldn't say that there was a causal relationship, but there was an association. And the association was strong enough for me, and the research was compelling enough for me that I decided to leave my job at Adler School to focus on this topic full time. And at that point, I began to resurrect some of the relationships I had with administrators in the Benton Harbor School District. And I approached the superintendent and asked him if he'd be interested in a pilot experiment in which we would change the food of a certain cohort of students and track any behavioral changes that might occur during the period during which they were eating foods that were fortified with the nutrients that we know are essential for brain health. And he was very open to the idea. And that started me on this journey of trying to figure out how to change the food that children eat within the context of a community that is really underserved. And a unique feature of this, what I would call an intervention, is the broad collaboration that's involved. So I can tell you, in order to make this happen, to feed children omega-3 fortified diet, foods with limited preservatives and dyes and other additives, we have donations from a number of vendors of product, of eggs and chickens and condiments from across the country. We engage someone who does supply chain management to help us get product from vendors all over the country to Benton Harbor. We engage nutrition services at the regional hospital system to prepare the food in their kitchens. So there are 3 staff in the regional hospital system that have played a critical role in preparing the foods. We engaged faculty at Andrews University in their Department of Health, Wellness, and Nutrition to develop the menus and the recipes that were consistent with the science on the nutritional neurosciences, but that also adhered to USDA standards and guidelines around school meals. So that was a delicate balancing act that the registered dietitians from Andrews and Lakeland had to navigate in order to create the meals. We had to figure out a way to get the food from the hospital kitchens to the schools, so Southwest Michigan Meals on Wheels picks up the food every day and brings fresh food to the school for the children every day. It was not difficult to engage others in the cause because I think at some very visceral, fundamental level, people get it, that what we eat impacts not just our physical health, but our brain health. It was also relatively easy to engage people because there are a lot of empathic people in the world who actually care about children who don't have what they should have. And I somehow was able to tap into their empathy and engage essentially a small army of people to do this work. I think our project staff list is 23 people deep, and that does not include the dozen or so volunteers that come here each week to help give out the food. It also doesn't include the school staff, who are strong advocates of this work and help us out with getting consent forms and all of the kind of logistical activities that have to be undertaken to make sure that we adhere to school policies. Every person who has engaged in this, whether they've shared that story with me or not, has a personal story. And that causes them to understand really deeply what this is about. There's a personal story for everybody, and they haven't always shared those stories with me. And so for that reason, I think the uptake on this is going to be, I don't think it's going to be that much of a challenge. I think the biggest challenge is going to be from food companies and those other interests that have a stake in the status quo. I can give you one example of a child who comes to this school. When his mother heard about it last fall, she said, "Sign me up. My child has been diagnosed with depression, bipolar disorder, and anxiety." And no family, extended or nuclear, is immune to some, because the brain is part of the body. And so I think people are looking for something, solutions, and I think people have an intuitive sense there's something wrong with our food system. So I think once people are educated, there are a number of aha moments. I think the resistance will come from those interests that are doing, frankly, very well with the status quo. So what I would love to do as a next step is to engage youth and some of the research around food in their community. I would love to have some of the students who are involved in this to map out food outlets in their community and count how many of them are liquor stores and how many of them are gas stations, so that they become literate on the food environment in their own community and begin to understand that this is not normal and that it's not healthy, and also to arm them not only with the research skills to do this, to kind of collect the data and analyze it, but then begin to advocate on their own behalf for a different kind of food environment in their community. I'd like to involve parents and guardians in that as well. I would like to work myself out of a job. I would like to be able to hand this off to communities to take it upon themselves to demand better food environments for themselves. 20 years from now, what I would like to experience is looking at the ingredients of a hamburger patty and not seeing chemicals and things I don't recognize. I just want to see real meat, and kids having a taste, an acquired taste for the natural sweetness of fruits and vegetables, as opposed to the heightened, artificially sweetened taste of high fructose corn syrup that's hyper. Because right now, the children's palates, sweet is like over the top sweet. The natural sweetness of a strawberry for them it's tart for them. What I've noticed is that the children are much more comfortable with us. They actually engage with one another and have conversations around meals, kind of like you do at home around your family table, sit down and eat. And they do that in these circular tables that we serve them, and they have conversations.